he looked at me and he said, and do you know what he said? He said, "Oh, hello, come in, take a seat, and welcome to the Tainted Tavern. Can I get you a drink?"
Come into the Tainted Tavern, come sit a while for free. We talk about our musings and devices we've been using.
Hello, and welcome to the ever so eclectic Tainted Tavern, and today we've got a double review for you, and this is a bit of a weird combination because we are going to be drinking another supermarket beer and giving it a taste and giving our opinions. Yes, this is the channel for your inner lush, and we're also going to be talking about the film Man on the Run, which looks at Paul McCartney immediately post-Beatles and his career with his so-called second band, mostly a backing band really, Wings. So we're going to be looking at that. The beer we drink in is called, it's down as a limited edition, which never take much notice of, and it's called Dark Bothy, Dark Mild. Now this is made for the co-op by Fine Ales Limited in Scotland. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but it's spelled F-Y-N-E, so fine to me. So this is a dark English mild, and it comes in at 4.2%, so it's quite light. We're going to get out the trusty Swiss Army knife, the type of knife that every lush should carry in their pockets, and we're going to pop it open. So let's get this poured, and I want to talk about Man on the Run. Now, Man on the Run recently had a limited cinema release. It tells the story of Paul McCartney immediately post-Beatles, and then goes through his entire career with Wings, which, as I've said, I'd never really thought of Wings as a real band, though I think McCartney did intend for it to be a real band at first, rather than just him and some backing musicians. But at the end of the day, Paul McCartney was an ex-Beatle and had the gravitational pull of a small planet, so good intentions maybe, but I really don't regard Wings as a real band in a traditional sense of a democratic unit that works together. It was very much Paul McCartney's band. Now, A Man on the Run, as I say, had a limited theatrical release, and it premiered on Amazon Prime yesterday. I was looking forward to it. I'm a big fan, huge Beatle fan, and I'm also one of those who's also a massive admirer of Paul McCartney, always have been. And I've got everything, to be honest, in my collection that he's done, including with the Beatles, with Wings, his solo stuff, even I've got everything, you know, the Fireman, everything he's ever done. I've even got that Barking Mad album from a few years ago with the kind of dancey remixes, electronic remixes, Twin Freaks, which is not a bad album, to be honest with you. But let's get the beer poured. Because as a McCartney fan, and a mega fan, and I wouldn't say, perhaps the word fan is not correct. I'm a great admirer. I regard him as a genius. Just he can be so frustrated. So there we've got the beer poured now. As I say, it's billed as a dark mild, called Dark Bothy. That's a lovely image, isn't it? On the cover art on the bottle. So it's very black, almost as black as a stout. You hold it up to the light and it does give a ruby kind of red glow to the nose. Very malty. As I say, it comes in at 4.2%. Very malty on the nose. And perhaps a little caramel. I haven't drunk a mild ale in many years, and that takes me back. It tastes like an English mild ale, brewed in Scotland mead. Anyway, let's go back to Man on the Run. Now, Man on the Run, I was quite impressed. It was truthful, very truthful, and it was far superior, I think, to the Wingspan documentary that came out several years back, in which Paul was interviewed by his own daughter and talking about Wings. This, on moments, was very truthful. It had a voiceover in sections from current day Paul. You never saw current day Paul. It was all old footage. And there's even some footage that I hadn't seen before, and that's saying something, because, as I say, I've been a massive fan for so long. When I heard there was new footage in there, I thought, yeah, pull the other one. You know, I've seen bootleg videos, I've seen so much that I didn't think there would be anything I hadn't seen, but there was one wonderful section towards the end of the film, because it leads up basically to when just after McCartney was arrested in Japan for carrying a big bag of his continental tobacco, nudge nudge wink wink, in his suitcase, and Wings sort of fell apart after that. It goes up to that period, and there's a lovely clip of McCartney working on the song Morse Moose and the Grey Goose, which is on the London Town album, which incidentally I think is a very underrated McCartney album. I love London's Town. It's one of the two Wings albums that hasn't yet had an archive release, so the other being Back to the Egg. Back to the Egg, I can take it or leave it. I don't know why, I've never really connected with that album, but I do love London Town. The first three songs, the sequencing of those first three songs on London Town are absolutely superb. But then the album seems to lose its way and become rather disjointed, and it's criminal that they never included Mull of Kintyre on that album, because Mull of Kintyre was the big single at the time, was a massive hit, and it should have been on London Town without a doubt. It might have raised the performance of the album on the marketplace. But Paul, if you are listening, you know, I doubt if you are, but if you're there relaxing at home on your very expensive sofa, wearing your Rupert the Bear pajamas, and just sitting there bored, so you flick around YouTube and you come upon this video, then why can't we get a London Town and Back to the Egg archive release? And while you do that, if you do that, also do something for Press to Play. Press to Play is probably one of the most underrated McCartney albums there is in his entire canon. I love Press to Play. But anyway, back to Man on the Run. Let's take a sip of the beer first. Yeah, you're getting caramel. As I say, it is very malty. There's a sweetness there. It's rather nice. It also tastes rather thick. It's got a thick mouthfeel, much like a stout or a porter, which it closely resembles, except when you hold it up to the light and you get that ruby red glow coming through it. It's decent. Well, this cost me £2.30, I think. I saw it in a co-op and I picked it up on impulse, mainly because I like the artwork. It's a decent pint. Anyway, Man on the Run. Okay, so it starts off with the end of the Beatles. McCartney, the often told story of McCartney being depressed and retiring to his place in Scotland with his new wife Linda, and drinking Scotch whiskey for breakfast, getting really depressed. Linda pulling him out of this trough, out of this depression. Paul and Linda's relationship is probably one of the strongest in rock music history. And I think Linda McCartney was an incredible lady. The way when she joined Wings, you know, and the press were out for her, because when the Beatles first split up, the press seemed to turn on McCartney violently. Albums which these days are considered classics, such as Ram, were just rubbished in the press, you know, and the critics. I think they just had a thing against Paul McCartney because he was the one who supposedly broke up the Beatles. And Paul does address this in Man on the Run, when he says, you know, I didn't really break up the Beatles, but I took the blame for it, you know. And if you know the history of the Beatles breakup, then Paul was put in a position where he could do nothing else. I mean, he did. George, Ringo, and John had vouched for Alan Klein as the manager. Paul saw right through him, and ultimately Paul would be proved to be right. So, you know, Paul was put in a position, and you watch the recent Peter Jackson version of the Let It Be movie, where he put it all together and called it Get Back. Put it all together, massive long hours of footage, something like 8 hours was it in total, maybe a bit longer. But you can see that Paul did tend to be bossy during that period. But that was only, in my opinion, from what you're looking at the Beatles and reading what you see in there, that was, from my opinion, that John and George especially just couldn't be bothered, you know. There was something special about the Beatles. It was the four of them, you know. Even Ringo was the glue that held the band together. He did his bit as well. And as good as John, George and Paul were, and they were spectacularly good. I mean, George's solo stuff give us some great stuff. All Things Must Pass, Cloud 9, Brainwash, you know, and several other brilliant albums. Same with John. The Plastic Ono Band album, also known as the Primal Scream album, I think is one of the finest rock albums ever made. And that album is far more punk and far more raw than any of the punk rock albums. Imagine is a good album. John's solo output, I think, was poor in comparison to George and Paul's, but that's because John released a quick spate of albums during the early years of splitting up with the Beatles, and then decided he was going to become an house husband for several years, and he retired. And when he did come back in 1980 with the Double Fantasy album, with every John Lennon track on that album is superb, but he ruined that by allowing Yoko to have songs on there. I'm sorry, but I can't get on with Yoko Ono. I don't hate her, and I don't blame her for breaking up the Beatles. I'm a Beatle freak, but I'm not one of those who despises Yoko Ono. But I've got to be honest, her style, the musician she is, it doesn't work alongside John. But that's just my opinion. Respect Yoko. So Paul addresses the fact that he was blamed for breaking up the Beatles, and undoubtedly that had a lot to do with the animosity the press had for him during the early years. And let's say from the end of the Beatles to Band on the Run, in the period between that, Paul released some great albums that stand up well today. Ram, for instance, is excellent. Red Rose Speedway, I think, is a stunningly good album. Wildlife, it's a strange one. When I first heard Wildlife many years ago, I got into the Beatles long after the Beatles had split up. I was born in 1965, so by the time I was 5 years old, the Beatles were all but finished. I didn't get into the Beatles until the 80s, and then I got into them by accident because I knew of the Beatles, obviously. But it's incredible to think that during the early 80s, people weren't really listening to the Beatles anymore, but I'd heard of them because I was a punk. I was heavily into punk rock. And the only thing I was aware of Beatlish was probably Mull of Kintyre in that year when Mull of Kintyre was such a massive song and you couldn't escape it. I hated Mull of Kintyre for a great many years. And the interesting thing is now I love Mull of Kintyre. I think it's a wonderful, timeless song. And Chrissy Hyde of The Pretenders gives a voiceover in the Man on the Run documentary during the time that they're talking about that period with Mull of Kintyre. And she says that if you listen to Mull of Kintyre now, it still sounds fresh, it's timeless. But any of the punk songs from that era sound incredibly dated, and she's right. Paul McCartney does write timeless music. Love him or loathe him, he's stunningly good. My cat's running around like a lunatic there. I thought he brought a rat in because we live on the mountainside. He's often bringing in rats. It's a gift for it. So where was I? Yes, so Band on the Run comes out, and all of a sudden McCartney is accepted by the press. Band on the Run is a stunningly good album. It's an excellent album. That year it came out, it sold like wildfire. It won awards. I think it won around then. Well, anyway, it won some awards, and suddenly the press started accepting McCartney again and taking him seriously. And you see this in the documentary. Band on the Run, as good as it is, and it is a stunning album, it's not my favourite Wings era album. I prefer the follow-up, Venus and Mars. Band on the Run, I think, is a fantastic album, but my favourite songs off Band on the Run would be Picasso's Last Words, 1984, and Mamounia, which are not the usual choices. I do love the album, but it's very, very polished. A bit too polished for my liking, which is why I prefer stuff like Venus and Mars, which was the following album. But that's just personal opinion. But So it covers all that. It covers all the early years and the well-known stories of McCartney and Denny Lane and Linda going to Lagos to record Band on the Run after the other two members of Wings had decided at the 11th hour, we're not coming, we don't want nothing to do with it, we've had a guts full of this, you know, it's not a real band, we've got no input, we're out of here. So the McCartney basically says, well, fuck you, I'm going to make the best album I can. And he did. He went out to Lagos and they recorded Band on the Run. The stories of him and Linda getting mugged out there is included in this. A lot of it, if you're a long-term fan, this is stuff that you'll already be aware of. But if you're new to this, to McCartney and Wings, and you want to learn more, then I think Man on the Run is aimed particularly at you, and you get some of the great stories. After the Band on the Run, they record, they get new members into Wings, in which at that period, in the 1975-76 period, is probably the best lineup the Wings ever had, where you had Jimmy McCulloch, brilliant guitarist, died very young, a very troubled man but a genius guitarist. And the 1976 then Wings Over America tour is covered fully in Man on the Run. It's really is a well-made documentary. And after that, then it goes into the later period of Wings. It doesn't really give much information on the period where Wings at the Speed of Sound was recorded, which is probably the most true band album rather than Paul McCartney and backing musicians albums, because you had Denny Lane and, you know, Joe English, and they're all doing their own little songs, their own vocals on that. So, but it doesn't cover much about that. Then it goes into the later period and you see Paul being busted in Japan. And then it goes to the aftermath of that. So Paul's released after spending, I think, 10 days in a Japanese prison. Apparently when he was in his prison cell, the prisoners next door would be knocking the walls. Do yesterday, and Paul would have to sing yesterday. That's the legend that he often tells. That's not covered in this. The beer is really, really nice. Then it deals with the way Wings fell apart. It's not as if the band suddenly broke up. There are interviews with several members of that lineup of Wings at that period. McCartney has come back licking his wounds from the Japanese tour, which fell apart when he was arrested, and he's immediately started working on an album that would become McCartney 2. But there are interviews with members of Wings then, and they are saying, yeah, we'll be touring again, yeah, we'll be in the recording studio again. It never happened. There's also footage then of the original video of the McCartney song Coming Up, the one that Lennon supposedly heard and decided to get back into music himself. He heard Coming Up and he thought it was spectacular. That I find strange, because Coming Up, as catchy as it is, it's a pretty simple song, and McCartney has done so much better stuff. Maybe John listened to it and thought, oh my God, I can do better than that shit. But anyway, Man on the Run's an excellent documentary. It's well worth watching. It's really well put together. And for once, Paul seems to be honest about things, about his part in the breakup of the Beatles, about his part in the falling apart of Wings. And there's some great footage of him and Linda and the rest of the band. It's just a wonderful, wonderful documentary. Thoroughly enjoyed it, thoroughly recommended. As I say, it's on Amazon Prime at the moment, streaming, so you can watch it there. If you subscribe to Amazon Prime. Let's finish off with a couple of mouthfuls of this dark bothy, dark mile. And I ask you, is there any other channel on YouTube like The Tainted Tavern that covers the sheer breadth of subjects that we cover? Cheers, Yakida, thanks for watching. Give this video a thumbs up, leave a comment below, and please subscribe and enjoy your beers and whiskies and pipe tobaccos and Paul McCartney albums. Cheers, bye, Yakida.